So thank you very much for participating in the first half of our event. To kick off the second event, as well as to introduce our next keynote speaker, I'm going to invite Cole Durham, Professor Durham, to come back to introduce our second speaker.
Well, if we could get everyone to come in and take seats. I know it's one of the things I've learned at these events is the breaks are often as important as the sessions, in the sense that that's where the real connections and networking happen. But to get on with the event, it's my privilege to introduce this afternoon Jan Figeľ, who is the EU Special Envoy for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief outside the EU. Some people often say that people should work on promoting it within the EU as well, but I have great sympathy because I know all the times that people have said that the ambassador at large for religious freedom in the U.S. should do more to track the U.S., and we unfortunately or fortunately do not have a foreign policy with ourselves. And the same thing happens, I think, in the EU. But one of the wonderful things is we are seeing a number of these institutions around the world. But I have to say it's been a particular privilege to get to know Jan Figeľ. He has had an extensive political career. I'm not sure how much is in the bios that you have, but among other things, he negotiated the entry of Slovakia into the EU. I don't think he negotiated the split of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but they did manage to get 2 votes in the EU as a result of that. So I don't know if he deserves credit for that or not. But he's also had in his background, he's been the Commissioner for Education in the EU, and those of you who know EU structures know that the commissioners are where some of the real power is in the EU, and to have that role in education has been very significant. But Jan has also been someone who has had extraordinary, since his appointment has exerted extraordinary energy. I think by the time I had met him, which was about 3 months after his appointment, I think he'd been to about 10 conferences. I don't know if I have the count right, but he has been an indefatigable worker in support of freedom of religion or belief around the world. And he has found particularly effective ways to work on this. Among other things, he has been someone who has recognized the significance of going back to concepts like dignity that are motivating concepts for all of us, that are open, the concepts that are upwardly open, that direct our attention upwards, and while they help channel and captivate different streams, political streams, controversies, it's something that helps draw us together and point us upward. Anyway, he's been a remarkable public servant in this area, and it's a great privilege for me to turn the time over to him now.
Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Professor Durham. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm really honored, pleased to be here. I didn't sleep as well like some or many, too much, and I came to the ideas which I would like to share, why these declarations are important, and what could be kind of overarching common ground or common good out of all these nice words, commitments, whether governmental or non-governmental. On one side, religion is with humanity from the beginning of the history. It helped to build relations and communities, religare, to relate. Faith serves to inspire, to strengthen spiritual life, to guide human person. On the other side, religion was and is frequently abused and misused for political power, for supremacy, to subdue the others. We have seen repetitive waves of persecution and mass atrocities, the latest one in Sri Lanka, but also New Zealand, Nigeria, Burkina Faso. Large majority of all population lives in countries where high or very high obstacles or limits for religious freedom are in place, and intolerance, discrimination, even persecution are on rise. Current FORB, as we say in European or international jargon, freedom of religion or belief, current FORB situation is calling for religious freedom climate change, because situation is very negative and trends are worrying. An expression of such change, such climate change among us, is culture of human dignity. That's why I think it's important to speak about human dignity if we want to speak or see for all, religious freedom for everyone, everywhere. Peace and peaceful cohabitation of different peoples, communities, cultures is based on justice, justice for all. And core of justice for all is respect to universal, fundamental human rights for all. And human dignity is foundational principle of all human rights. So this is interrelated. If we want to see peace, we need to see justice, and justice is about human rights for all, and principle for justice and human rights is dignity for all. So why do we need to emphasize the dignity? Because we need to defend principles of justice against religious fundamentalism, against ideological and totalitarian oppression or ethical relativism. We witness opposition to universality of fundamental human rights, divisions among countries and nations on human rights, refusal or questioning of these rights in time of migration crisis. If there is a point of convergence and of consent between religious humanists and secular humanists, it is human dignity as a base of each person's undeniable and inalienable rights. Dignity is a privileged way to address issues of freedom and equality in society correctly. Human dignity is the common denominator for the three monotheistic religions. All Abrahamic traditions consider that religious freedom is rooted in the dignity of human person. In Islam, human dignity, or karama, is an important and a well-established principle. The very foundation of the dignity of man is that he has been endowed with reason, freedom of belief, opinion, and expression. As a result, no one has the right to judge people for their faith or persecute and discriminate against them on religious or ethnic grounds, nor to wage war against someone because of his beliefs. The right to dignity is a key part of the Beirut Declaration on Religious Freedom, the other one from Maqasid Philanthropic Islamic Association in June 2015. There is a powerful and clear text reminding us of the Quranic roots of the freedom, of this freedom. The importance of man and dignity in the Quran is established since I quote, the angels are asked to bow down to Adam. In Judaism, the notion of human dignity, medaber al-kavod, is also a key concern. In the first place, human dignity stems from the man's resemblance to the image of God in the story of Genesis. Other references underline the importance of dignity in Judaism as well. The dignity granted to man gives him freedom, but also demands of his responsibility and creativity. In Christianity, human dignity is equally central. Let me share this quote, just the beginning. A sense of the dignity of the human person has been impressing itself more and more deeply on the consciousness of contemporary man, and it continues. This is the first paragraph of the Dignitatis Humanae of 1965, the Declaration on Religious Freedom made by the Second Vatican Council. It speaks to all of us today, and I quote again, the Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person. So that's why religious freedom and dignitatis humanae. So therefore, major faith traditions affirm a commitment to upholding the dignity and the equal worth of all human beings, women and men. It is often forgotten that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based on and derived from values common to major religions. Human dignity has three interrelated or interconnected dimensions. It can be articulated in three of them, but they need to be brought together. First of all, human dignity concerns me, myself. My specificity is unique, in common with each and every person, past, present, and future, billions of persons. I am unique. And from this uniqueness, I draw my dignity and project my specificity. This is something original that nobody can ever replicate or replace. It is a specific and unique contribution to my fellow human beings. If this originality, this authenticity and uniqueness is not revealed, is not fulfilled, it will be lost. My own dignity causes me to interpret the world, make choices, and interact with others according to my own conscience, my reason, and my convictions. To do so, I need to exercise all my freedoms: freedom of thought, of expression, of action. So human dignity is not limited to my own freedom. It includes the freedom of the other. This is the second dimension. It invites me to exercise tolerance and to define my limits in order to respect the other. There is, of course, also an imperative of equity and equality, and therefore of justice, to render to each one his due. This is the fact of justice. It contributes directly and centrally to living together in a city, in a community. So human dignity is a responsibility that must be shouldered. If dignity gives rise to rights, it also implies duties and responsibilities. These responsibilities are not fixed or static. They must be developed and exercised and maintained through time. It's a different responsibility of child, of adolescent, of adult. In addition, human dignity is not only an individual responsibility. Since I am part of community, the dignity has also a collective, a social or societal dimension. The religious social responsibility in particular is that of seeking the common good. For their part, religious actors, religious leaders, need to contribute to the strengthening of social cohesion and justice in society. And consequently, we need to rediscover the old notion of the common good, bonum commune. This was decisive objective, for example, for Schuman, for De Gasperi, for Adenauer, when they launched unparalleled project of European integration. This notion has the advantage of summarizing the principles and objectives set out in the European treaties, which are solidarity, subsidiarity, and proportionality. It seems today, again, the most relevant ethical and political vision to face the most burning issues we need to address today in the world. And actually, bonum commune is a win-win policy. This is the best combination I can advise or defend. I want to add some references on the European Union because as the first ever EU special envoy, I feel it's important. Any contribution that European Union seeks to make to the cause of freedom of religion or belief must be constructive and promoted through rights-based approach and cooperation. Not teaching, not preaching, but sharing. We are here to listen, to dialogue, but also to learn, to play host to each other, and it is possible only through shared hospitality, that we can live together without divisions and conflicts, united in diversity. It is possible, and it is important. Second, attention to youth and education is a prerequisite for a fruitful hospitality. Schools, universities, and textbooks play a major role in the presentation of the other. There is dignity of difference, says Jeffrey Sachs. We are all different in identity. We are all equal in our dignity. Europe and the world has had to learn the importance of education to peace and reconciliation. Even Robert Schuman, Père de l'Europe, or Father of Europe, in his book expressed his faith that the detoxification of history textbooks on both sides was one of the first necessities of peace. And this is conditio sine qua non, for example, for Israeli-Palestinian peaceful coexistence. Finally, the European Union is attaching to human dignity the primary position in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the Union. It's Title I, Article 1 is called Human Dignity. Equal dignity makes us all possessing place within one human family, one humanity. Therefore, in line with the UDHR, spirit of brotherhood, sisterhood, is our duty and right to be treated as brothers and to treat others as brothers. Concept of dignity is base, reason, and logic behind the universality of human rights. Dignity is the root or source of inalienable and undeniable rights of each person. Universality of human rights is logical character of fundamental human rights. And fraternity is fruit of this conviction. Dignity is the root and fraternity is the fruit of these roots. So simple and so emblematic. One equal dignity calls for one equal fraternity. This represents one humanity and a universality of humankind. Individual human dignity entered global constitutional history in small country. You know where? In Ireland, in 1937. But after drama of World War II, we can find it in many modern constitutions, in federal Germany, in India, but also, of course, in the UN Charter and the UDHR. In order to bear more and better fruits of this universal, humane approach in our conflicting world, we must cultivate notion, understanding, and promote human dignity for all. We need to nurture culture of human dignity. And let me conclude on the Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone, Everywhere. This was adopted in December 2018, not only to commemorate the UDHR and anniversary, but especially to recommit to the noble objectives and articles of this Universal Declaration. By issuing the Punta del Este Declaration, signatories wish to respect and protect human dignity of every human person as its innate worth. And in order to make even stronger an active commitment, they subscribe to human dignity for everyone, everywhere. Dignity is described here as the foundational principle, the criterion, and the objective of all public policies. It will be discussed in the panel, but I want to say this is not fait accompli. This is contribution and invitation. And I see nice brochures with the internet address to join this declaration by all those who share these principles. You are cordially invited. There is open space for joining the signatories. In other words, this declaration is a commitment to tapping the inspirational potential of the notion of human dignity and to promote culture of human dignity. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, economy and security are necessities like daily bread. We need daily bread. But culture gives sense to our lives, to our living together, gives meaning to our relations. While economy and security is in the base, the culture is on the top of hierarchy. In this respect, there are many commendable initiatives on peaceful coexistence from Morocco, Bahrain, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, from Vatican, from Al-Azhar. Therefore, it's time to move together forward and upward. It means to do more and better. More means from places like Oslo, Beirut, Washington, Marrakesh, Punta del Este, to address the whole international community. From networks of like-minded and the interrelated to all people. History reminds us it was made by the active or creative minorities. History is made by creative minorities. Majority joins after a certain moment, but we need creative, active, courageous, brave minorities. And better means from words to deeds, from deeds to habits. From habits we get characters, and characters represent cultures or shift of culture and destiny. This represents qualitative change. Culture of human dignity for all is opposite of ignorance. It is against intolerance, against indifference, against phobia, against fear. 21st century can be an era of hope, replacing the century of genocides, century of divisions, manipulating propaganda, violence. We must stand up to our promise, never again a genocide. Therefore, we must learn how to live, not only to exist together in diversity. And special attention must be given to young people, with youth, for youth, and through youth, to set peaceful future for the MENA region, for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for democratic Pakistan, for peace and real development in the ACP countries, etc., etc. Ladies and gentlemen, respect to human dignity starts with respect to freedom of religion or belief. That is freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. We all know about growing attacks on FORP. Situation is negative, trends are worrying. Therefore, Washington Ministerial is important. We need religious freedom, climate change. Religious freedom, climate change is possible with openness and support towards human dignity culture. I wish this ministerial summit and constructive more than 80 events here in Washington, D.C., but especially hundreds of policymakers, experts, religious representatives, civil society leaders would bring a new, strong commitment for human dignity culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan, for that wonderful introduction to our next panel, where we want to explore some of the declarations that you referenced and how they point to human dignity. I'm Father Deacon Andrew Bennett, Senior Fellow and Director of the North American Action Team here at the Religious Freedom Institute. This next panel, as I said, will explore in greater depth how we can advance this agenda of human dignity in various ways. Jan Fiegel has just reminded us about the roots of human dignity in many different religious traditions. As a Canadian, I'm reminded of the wonderful witness of the recently departed Jean Vanier, the founder of l'Arche, the l'Arche communities around the world. And paraphrasing him, he drove home this idea of how we understand human dignity in our day-to-day lives. To be able to encounter and then recognize the dignity of another is to become more fully human ourselves. And so I think what we want to do now as we call up this next panel is to explore that as to how we can advance that understanding through various declarations. So again, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome to the dais here our speakers, Brett Scharfs, David Trimble, and Sheikh Umar Al-Qadri, and I'll introduce them briefly. So Brett Scharfs, a colleague and friend, is the Rex E. Lee Chair and Professor of Law at Brigham Young University's J. Reuben Clark Law School and Director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. His teaching and scholarly interests include law and religion, legal reasoning and rhetoric, philosophy of law, and legislation and regulation. The rest of his bio is in your handout, so I'll leave it to you to read that. David Trimble is a colleague of mine at the Religious Freedom Institute. David serves as director of the RFI's Center for Religious Freedom Education and also senior fellow for the RFI's Middle East and International Religious Freedom Policy Action Teams. Finally, we have Sheikh Umar Al-Qadri, founder and CEO of the Irish Muslim Peace and Integration Council. Sheikh Al-Qadri is a renowned Islamic scholar who was brought up in the Netherlands and traveled to Pakistan at the age of 15 to study Islamic law. After completion of his studies from the Minhaj ul-Quran Islamic University, he moved to Ireland in 2004 and established the Al-Mustafa Islamic Center in Dublin. He's one of the leading Muslim clerics in Europe that work to promote an inclusive and plural society, and he's a firm believer in interfaith dialogue and relations. I've asked the speakers to limit their opening remarks to between 8 to 10 minutes so we can have a bit of a dialogue between the four of us. The main things I've asked them to focus on in exploring these next three declarations: first of all, what role do these declarations have in advancing respect for human dignity and religious freedom in the world? What sparked these efforts? What was the impetus behind them? What has been the impact of these declarations to date? What are some of the next steps in advancing the goals of these declarations? And what are some of the various challenges that they are facing? And then finally, in keeping with Jan Fiegel's encouragement to us, what more can be done? So I'll pass it first to my colleague, David Trimble.
Thank you, Andrew. Good to be with you today. Thank you for enduring the heat. I was going to say to Hamza, I think he's gone to nap after 21 hours. I don't blame him. I drove in 20 minutes and I feel like I've had jet lag. So good to be with you today. I'd like to just begin my brief 8 minutes by, asking the question, why the American Charter for Religious Freedom and Conscience? Why now? Why isn't it an appropriate time? Why do we need it? Let me offer 2 or 3 suggestions as I consider that question. First, revolves around language markers, because language changes and the understanding of terms and ideas change over time. Language is often an indicator of cultural shift, of change of ideas. So step with me just for a moment, very quickly. About 200 years back, step with me across the Atlantic into the city of London. An Oxford-born expert in architecture, over the last 30 years or so of his life, was responsible for building designing 52 churches. The capstone of his work was St. Paul's Cathedral. In 1708, when that cathedral was finished, you might have picked up your iPhone on that day and read the news, the London Times, and it would have said, "It's just awful." Well, in that day, the word awful meant full of awe. So different today, right? Now step back with me across the pond here into the United States. Time is 1941 to about 1947, right there in the midst of World War II. It's during that phase that you actually find, as far as I can tell at this point, that's when you find the most proliferation of the use of the phrase freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. In U.S. English literature in the U.S., it appears more then, it's discussed more then during that time. It held true for about 30, nearly 40 years at about that same level. And then about 1980, the use of that phrase and the examination of that phrase in U.S. literature tanked. So around 1980, I started having children, millennials, and I had 3 millennials. And things started to change during that time. And concurrent with that downswing in that proliferation of the concept of religious freedom in literature was an uptick in what we would probably perceive to be hot button issues of our day. So you see a real curve in different concepts. And so as that uptick began, then you didn't really see religious freedom come back on the rise until about the mid-1990s with Generation Zers. I'm trying to figure out who all these people are, but I think that's about right. That's when you started to have the uptick in Generation Z. Well, when you start to look at that, you notice some cultural trends going on in the United States. The religious freedom no longer was really receiving the focus that it once did. Secularism was on the rise. Religious freedom was no longer respected in the academy. And we are where we are today. Why? The American Charter. Because language changes and culture changes with it. Second, because conflict, confusion, and misrepresentation threaten to undermine the bedrock principle of religious freedom and the ability to engage one another meaningfully in civil dialogue. Now that's what the American Charter really is. So follow with me just for a moment. The public release of the American Charter took place on the eve of November 29th, last fall, at the National Archives in the shadow of the Magna Carta. There gathered together, culminating 3 years of literally hard labor that brought together diverse religious leaders from the right and from the left. 77 original signatories on the document. And you ask, how did they get there? How did they get there? Well, two things, and this relates to what this charter is all about. First, those drafters came together and they were willing to acknowledge they had differences. With respect, they said, we're not going to change our opinions, but we're not going to let that divide us. And so they moved forward on those terms. And it really was that willingness to embrace their differences and to sit across the table and acknowledge with respect based in human dignity that produced this document. Related to that was their willingness to come together. Now, if you read nothing else in this document, read one page, the preface. You'll learn a lot right there. 4 times in one page, you'll find the term or terms together and come together. Once you notice that, then understand that that is a reoccurring theme in all 16 articles of the American Charter. The willingness to come together because you believe in the human dignity of everyone at the table. It's remarkable, really, that these 77 signatories could come together. Well, there's a lot left to answer on this, Andrew. I don't want to unpack it too much yet, but I don't want to take too much time. But
Great.
I've got a lot more to say, but I'll let you lead the way.
Thank you, David. Thank you. That's a good taster for us. We'll move now to Brett Scharfs, who's going to speak about a declaration already referenced by Jan Fiegel, and that's the Punta del Este Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone, Everywhere. Brett.
Thank you, Deacon Father Andrew. When I was 10 years old, I received the perfect gift. Neither before nor after have I received a gift, I think, that made me as happy as this gift. It was perfect in every way. It was a tool, but it was really 10 tools. It was perfectly crafted. It was expertly made. It had diverse uses. It was a Swiss Army knife. Did any of you receive one of those when you were 10 years old? Today, I'd like to talk about what I've come to think of as the Swiss Army knife of international human rights. And that's this concept of human dignity for everyone, everywhere. Now, I want to frame this a bit by asserting my belief, my concern, that human rights are actually much more under threat than the human rights community wants to acknowledge. I spend most of my time advocating human rights around the world, and I notice 4 major problems, and I could expand the list to 10 or more if we had time. First is human rights maximalism, the proliferation of human rights, the idea that human rights are the answer to every question. The second is human rights skepticism or even cynicism, which is often a reaction to this maximalism, but it is the assertion that human rights are empty or meaningless or abstract or just Western concepts. The third is human rights special pleading. This is the idea that one human right is the only one that matters. Now, I'm an advocate for freedom of religion and belief, but it's important whenever I'm advocating for that to connect it to other human rights as well. And all of this results in a type of human rights fatigue, which those who I sometimes, perhaps unfairly, perhaps derisively, describe as the high church of human rights don't fully appreciate. About 2 years ago, we at the International Center for Law and Religion Studies began thinking about what we might do to counteract this and to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as part of those consultations, Jan Figel, who spoke to us a moment ago, was visiting, and we spent 3 days brainstorming. And during that time, there was a decisive moment where he described his role as EU Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief outside Europe, calling up a country and saying, "I'd like to come talk to you," and getting dead silence on the other side, followed by a very reluctant, "We're really busy." But Jan, patient man that he is, just waited. And eventually, the voice on the other side of the phone said, "Well, what do you want to talk about?" And he said, "I'd like to come talk about human dignity and how it's important for all people in all places at all times." And there was another pause, but it was shorter. And the voice that came back was of a different tone. Human dignity, karama in Arabic. That's an important concept in the Quran. It's really important to us Muslims. Why don't you come? Let's talk. And what he noticed was that human dignity was a door opener, a conversation starter, and a bridge builder. And we began brainstorming about the many practical ways that human dignity is actually a useful concept. We began studying this, and what we found out is that it was really important at the time of the drafting of the UDHR. As previously noted, both the preamble and Article 1 of the UDHR both begin with invocations of human dignity. And when the 18 countries that endeavored to start drafting the UDHR sat down, it was really chaotic. There were so many different ideas about where to start, what to include. The first draft put together by the secretary, John Humphreys, was a couple 100 pages long with hundreds of footnotes and a huge appendix. And frankly, they were stuck. And it was actually P.C. Chang, the vice chair and Chinese delegate, who had the breakthrough insight. He recalled that the preamble to the UN Charter briefly mentioned human dignity. And he said, perhaps we can start there. And in a way, this broke the logjam. The articulation, specification, and definition of the 30 articles that became the UDHR was facilitated in significant measure by focusing on what was shared, which was this commitment to human dignity. And what we began to think is that perhaps at our moment, here at a time when climate change is needed with respect to human rights, refocusing on the concept that made agreement then possible might help rejuvenate, reinvigorate, re-energize, and perhaps even restore the Human Rights Project, which is under pressure from so many different directions today. And so began a year-long process of studying and drafting. 4 conferences were held during 2018 on the theme of human dignity. The first at Central European University, where the themes were human dignity's capacity to reach beyond division towards agreement. This was followed by a conference at Oxford University focusing on the founding figures of human dignity. Peter Petkoff was instrumental in that conference. We focused on people like Charles Malik, Rene Cassin, Eleanor Roosevelt, P.C. Chang. What were their views about human dignity? We also focused on the many uses of human dignity. This is where the image of the Swiss Army knife came up. Then our symposium at BYU Law School, the 25th annual Law and Religion Symposium in October, focused on the connections between human dignity and religious freedom. Here, as Jan Fagel noted, the Catholic Vatican II document Dignitatis Humanae is a landmark. And finally, a large group of scholars, about 40 of us, gathered in Punta del Este, Uruguay, to draft and seek agreement on a text. And it was a little hard. It made me have a little bit of sympathy for those drafters of the UDHR. When you have people from 35 countries, different political views, different religious views, just different cultural assumptions, different legal systems, different languages, the process of drafting is difficult. But I think the focus on human dignity made it possible. And what emerged was a document with 10 articles, all of which identify very practical, specific uses of human dignity. It doesn't seek a definition because, as Cole said, human dignity is generative, open, and it's also elevating. It's difficult to get into really harshly politicized and degraded conversations about human dignity. And the generative character we've noted again and again in the 6 or 8 months since the Dignity Declaration was adopted. In conference in India, we met Tim Shaw's father-in-law, Vinay Samuel, who has been working for years with the poorest of the poor in Bangalore. And his ministry has been described in a doctoral dissertation as a ministry of dignity, and his theology is a theology of dignity. And what we learned in India is that there are unique Indian perspectives on human dignity that are quite different from Western, European, North American perspectives. We learned something similar at a recent conference in Africa, in Botswana. The African Consortium of Law and Religion Scholars spent 4 days discussing human dignity, came up with a companion document to the Punta del Este Declaration called African Perspectives on Human Dignity. The web page is on the back side of the brochure that we've given you, and you can find that African Perspectives document there. It's really interesting because one of the things that came out is that in many languages in Africa, including Nigeria, I learned, correct me if I'm wrong, human rights is a term that does not translate elegantly. It sounds foreign, but not human dignity. Human dignity exists in the languages of Africa, including Setswana in South Africa. And I just returned from China. I was going to try to impress you with my jet lag story, but it's not nearly as hard as Malaysia. In China, the idea of human dignity is a concept that I believe has the capacity to lower the temperature and the volume on human rights discourse. One of our colleagues there, Zhang Chenfan, just published a book called Classical Chinese Conceptions of Human Dignity. And this is a really important idea in Confucius thought, with different strands and elements of dignity. Just like in Western thought we have a status-based dignity, the dignity of the king, there's also an equality-based dignity, the dignity and value of all human beings. And so think of all the Confucius institutes that China's been setting up around the world. And they're striving for some idea that would be appealing as a soft power concept that is substantively Chinese. Well, what better than human dignity? So think of it. The Muslim world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, which I haven't yet mentioned, but the Latin American Consortium for Law and Religion Studies is also working on a companion document on Latin American perspectives on human dignity. This is my hope. It is that climate change is possible, that human rights can become less divisive and less controversial a decade from now than they feel today. And I believe it's going to be efforts like these collective voice declarations, that, as Tim so beautifully put it, put to lie simple-minded relativism and make more difficult easy cynicism. We live in a world where those two things are not small challenges. They're major, major challenges to all of us in all of our work. And if these type of efforts can help create mechanisms of response to the temptation of relativism or the temptation of skepticism descending into cynicism, then that will be something important. As Jan said, the Punta del Este Declaration is open for signature. We're not seeking signatures from everyone. We're seeking signatures from serious people, academics, human rights experts, government leaders, religious leaders. And if you're interested, Denise Lindberg, who's here, will have a sheet of paper. And all we need is your name, an email address, and a title. Everyone who signs the declaration does so in their individual capacity, not in an institutional capacity. But if we added a half dozen here today, that would be, from this group, I think we could continue to expand and amplify the message of human dignity for all people in all places.
Thank you very much, Brett.
Thanks.
Thank you. Sheikh Umar is going to speak to us about the Marrakesh Declaration.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, may I first of all greet you with the Islamic greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all. It was absolutely fine if you didn't respond to the greeting, because we are here to advocate religious freedom. And it is your right to choose whether you adopt to a religious practice, a tradition or not. I happen to be from Ireland. As you've heard, I am the chair of the Irish Muslim Peace and Integration Council. As someone who lived in Ireland for more than 16 years, I've always been told and I've always heard that many, many Americans can trace their roots back to Ireland. So let me actually try to see if that is true, if that is the case. How many of you have Irish roots? Can you please raise your hands? That's a lot of people. Interestingly, I'm talking about greeting. In Ireland, the greeting is Diagwit. That's the Irish greeting. And the response to that is Dias Miragwit. And what it means is, interestingly, it means, Diagwit means, may God be with you. And Dias Miragwit means, may God and Mary be with you. So although it's an Irish greeting, it also happens to be a religious greeting. I want to just share, first of all, the circumstances, the context of when I became aware of the Marrakesh Declaration. As you've heard previously, I grew up in the Netherlands, and at the age of 15, I traveled to Pakistan to study Islamic sciences. While I studied in Pakistan for the next 7 years, and I studied Islamic jurisprudence, Islamic theology, and I lived in a Muslim majority country, one thing became very much apparent to me. And that was that there was a striking contrast between theory and between practice in regards to the attitude to non-Muslim minorities, the attitude and the behavior towards non-Muslims. This was something that seriously bothered me. And I then traveled to Holland and stayed for about 2 years there, 1.5 years before I traveled to Ireland. And during my engagements as an imam, I was always asked, by various different people, non-Muslims, that is this the norm within Muslim majority countries, how they treat non-Muslims? Particularly around 2015, when the world actually found out about the atrocities committed by Daesh in the name of Islam, where they persecuted Yazidis, Christians, Muslims that did not share the same ideology. They demolished churches and trampled upon the teachings of Islam, in my view. People continuously asked, what are the Muslim leaders doing about it? Why aren't they speaking against it? And around 2016, this is when more than 250 Muslim scholars came together in Morocco, in Marrakesh. And the initiative was led by one of the most influential Muslim scholar, Muslim philosopher in the Muslim world, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya. And his view and the view of many Muslim leaders and Muslim scholars and practitioners was that our faith is a faith in which the scripture, the hadith tradition, they lay down the foundation of pluralism, acceptance of diversity. In fact, religious freedom it's divine will. It is a God-gifted right to humanity according to the Quran. The Quran, for example, states there is no compulsion in faith. It states in another verse, whoever wants to believe may believe, whoever wants to reject and disbelieve has the right to disbelieve. And in regards to diversity, the Quran states that if God wanted to create all humans as believers, He could have done so. But He chose deliberately not to create them all in the same, with the same ideology and the same background. So this diversity in ideologies, in faith, is according to the Quran, it is divine will. When we look at, for example, the Constitution of Medina, which is the Charter of Medina, the Prophet Muhammad, he stated, and the first article of that particular constitution is, it lays down the foundation of equal citizenship. That irrespective of your faith, irrespective of your tribal background, once you are part of the community, the human community, you have all equal rights. And when we talk about basic human rights, religious freedom is, according to the Quran, one of the most essential basic human rights. So Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya and many other scholars with the same view, in fact more than 250 very influential Muslim leaders, they came together in Marrakesh, and they came together to affirm the rights of religious minorities under Muslim rule and to formulate a Muslim call for their protection. Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, he said that there is a sickness in the world, referring to religious persecution in the name of Islam. And we have the treatment for this within Islam, within the Islamic tradition. So the meeting in Marrakesh resulted in the Marrakesh Declaration on the rights of religious minorities in predominantly Muslim majority communities, also known as the Marrakesh Declaration. So this declaration is inspired by the Constitution of Medina and by the Quran, and just as the Constitution of Medina, the Marrakesh Declaration also encourages religious freedom and coexistence among religious groups. That cooperation must go beyond mutual tolerance and respect to providing full protection for the rights and liberties to all religious groups in a civilized manner that avoids coercion, bias, and arrogance. The declaration also encourages Muslim scholars and legal experts to develop an Islamic concept of citizenship based on the principles of equal treatment, inclusion, and pluralism. The declaration also calls upon Muslim leaders and intellectuals around the world to develop a jurisprudence for the concept of citizenship, which is inclusive of diverse groups. Such jurisprudence should be rooted in Islamic tradition and principles and mindful of the global challenges. The Marrakesh Declaration, ladies and gentlemen, was the first time in modern history that Muslim scholars formulated a clear rejection of religious persecution and discrimination and a clear call for the protection of religious minority rights. They linked human rights with core Muslim values and traditions. So the Marrakesh Declaration contributes to strengthening the legitimacy of human rights and enhancing its acceptance and support within the Muslim community and the Muslim world. Although there have been many other attempts in modern times to address equality of citizenship and religious persecution of non-Muslim minorities in Muslim majority countries, but those different attempts were not really rooted in Islamic theology. They were not really rooted in Islamic jurisprudence, and often they were accused of being based on Western Enlightenment derived concepts. So they did not find that acceptability within the Muslim world. So the impact of the declaration has been that there has been a renewed thinking by many Muslim majority countries regarding the concept of equal citizenship, in which religious freedom is obviously very essential. For example, in Morocco, in Bahrain, and in Pakistan, there have been certain attempts being made to start a discussion regarding equal citizenship. And in regards to the next steps in advancing the goals of the declaration, I think it is vital that firstly its message should become a social norm within the Muslim world. There are still those, unfortunately, that preach exclusion, that preach messages of hatred and division that leads to violence. I think governments can play a very significant role, Muslim majority countries, those governments, not least by writing principles of equal citizenship into the law. And these efforts, they aren't static and they shouldn't stop, they can't stop. The environment is changing. And our responses should also change. Embedding the ideas of this declaration as normal attitudes in general society is a key effort. This means that not to make it only part of the legislation of the countries, but also part of the curricula in educational institutes, and not only in secular institutes, but also the madrasas, the religious institutions, for example. It is very essential to make it part of the curricula in those countries, so it becomes a norm, and everybody understands the importance and significance of this declaration. Thank you very much.